Welcome to the Montana Festival of the Book, the 9th annual Montana Festival of the Book. We began last night with a kickoff event at the Wilma, Define-a-thon. That was just a wild time, a lot of fun with people defining words and things like you learn for your vocabulary that is a word, that Zeister is a word, and the mayor knew what that word meant. So hey, it's always an educational experience, and we're going to start with an educational experience here with writing historical fiction. We're going to start with Stephen Gough, who's the author of Colter's Run, about the legendary John Colter, who is one of the most fascinating pieces of American history. He is the only one who left the Lewis and Clark expedition back in 1806 to become a fur trapper, and he ended up courting danger time and time again. He also explored what's now called Yellowstone, but for a long time it was called Colter's Run. Colter's Hell, that's right, that's why he had to run. He achieved immortality too with his escape from the Blackfeet. That's the part that was known as Colter's Run. There's not that much known about Colter's life in effect, but Steve takes what we do know, he's turned it into a historical novel, and he explores the kind of man that he believes John Colter was. And Steve, like Colter, is Virginian by birth, and he is a Vietnam veteran Marine. And he draws on those experiences as a Marine, the long sleepless nights, the monsoon rains, hunger, thirst, terror, and sorrow. And I'm sure those all helped in helping him reimagine Colter's life. Please welcome Stephen Gough.
Thank you, Judy. I think she just gave about 90% of my talk. I would like to read a couple of pages of the beginning of my book just to warm you up to this man, to the times, and to the events. But first I'd like to read part of a poem by Rudyard Kipling entitled The Explorer. And Kipling wrote this in 1898, and I'm quite sure that he had John Colter in mind when he wrote this. And it goes like this.
Don't want to miss a word.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Good, I just have a little trouble seeing. Something hidden. Go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges. Something lost behind the ranges, lost and waiting for you. Go. It's Rudyard Kipling. Spring labored in the high-up mountains of the Absaroka and in the valley of the Estoba-Onza, the Elk River. The long wait was almost over. Warmth was coming. Dreary months of sunless days, of long nights, bitterly cold, gradually, stubbornly, almost reluctantly giving way, and yet it was as it always had been. Seasons come and seasons go, changing little in the life of the nomadic red man in the 12 millennia since his distant ancestors first crossed over to the New World, and the last vestiges of the Ice Age receded to the far north. The culture of the Absaroka, known far and wide as a Crow, never reckoned the progress of time by the white man's calendar, but by the vicissitudes of nature and its four seasons, fickle, capricious, and unforgiving, daily influencing their very existence. And this particular winter past would not soon be forgotten in the buffalo skin lodges of the Absaroka. A new conflict, inevitably ending their way of life, was also coming with scant warning to these children of the big-beaked bird and to all the native peoples of the West. They did not recognize its approach, nor heed the ominous signs. Far to the east, across the vastness of the great arid plains, to the very banks of the Father of Waters, a different people, were also emerging from a long winter's icy grip. They were a race of a fairer hue, equally proud, but profoundly ambitious, possessed of energy and resources hitherto unrealized by the horse-loving nomads of the West. They called themselves Americans, many of whom were looking west, coveting the land of the Crow and their neighbors. They too acknowledged the four seasons coursing their life's annual paths. Unlike their red brethren, though, the land, in fact, nature itself, was to be conquered, controlled, harnessed to their advantage and behest, all too often heedless of those who rightfully claimed dominion. To these Americans, the Astopaonza was Yellowstone country, the great watershed of the upper Missouri, claimed by international purchase and commercial rights, and to hell be damned the red-skinned savages who just happened to reside therein. The year was 1808. 32 winters have passed since the colonies, those rebellious 13 of my father's time, declared their inalienable rights and sovereign independence from the English crown. The author of their declaration, the Honorable Thomas Jefferson, was still the President of the United States, and his lifelong vision of the young republic, the rising nation spread over a wide and fruitful land, was slowly, inexorably coming to pass. The time of conflict has already arrived. 2 summers removed since Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and the men of the Corps of Discovery returned from the western lands in triumph to St. Louis on the Mississippi. With their return, the sleepy little river port was transformed into a hotbed of economic exploration and adventure, the point of origin for the first fur-trapping expeditions to challenge the wilds of the Yellowstone and the upper Missouri River Territory, the extreme range of the Louisiana Purchase. The word was soon out across the land, setting in motion a national movement unmatched since its inception. It was an optimistic time, rife with expectation, fueled by unbridled exuberance, and of such vital importance to the young republic, bulging at its seams to grow, to achieve, to manifest its destiny. An age replete with audacious, resourceful, courageous men, independent, strong-willed, capable frontiersmen, men who would lead the way west, endure loneliness and hardship, privation and fatigue, and for many, ultimately, an ignoble death. All the while tapping its riches, bringing commerce and trade, planting the seeds of an ever-expanding American culture. The first entrepreneur of note and boldest challenger thus far was that most infamous of all the colorful characters to ever sail, paddle, or pole the western waterways of the American frontier, the half-Spaniard, half-Creole, New Orleans-born Senor Manuel Lisa. Organizing the Missouri Fur Company, the first American trading enterprise to vie for the beaver riches of the Northwest, Lisa gathered a small armada of keelboats and wooden pirogues, manning them with seasoned crews of salty, veteran French-Canadian rivermen, those sturdy engages of wilderness riverway lore. And with his trusty engages, the irascible Spaniard enjoined a ragtag command of long rifle-toting American backwoodsmen and set sail in pole and oar for the fabled La Roche Jaune, the Yellowstone, soon after the Corps of Discovery's return. By the fall of '07, Lisa had pushed 50 of his backwoods Argonauts all the way to the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Bighorn River, establishing a rough-hewn log stockade, the farthest continental reach of American civilization. He called his cottonwood redoubt Fort Ramon. Fort Ramon was the loneliest of lonely, high-walled, hone log outpost in a land so remote, so unfriendly, so adverse to the comforts of even the simplest of backwoodsmen. This fort, This wilderness hovel of logs and mud, for all its coarseness, was christened and named with sublime affection by the Spaniard for his pampered young son, Ramon. Yet to the raw-boned men who held no such affectations for Lisa or his blood offspring would forever know this crude trapper's enclosure derisively as Manuel's Fort. From this most distant of all outposts, American trappers, the first of the mountain men, set their metal traps for beaver in the nearby waters of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone, in the heart of the land of the Absaroka, the proud, the ever-vigilant Crow Nation. From Manuel's Fort, little noticed by man, civilized or primitive, a lone horseman rode west with the Yellowstone as his guide to the far-off river valley of the headwaters of the Missouri River. Near mythical, known to the red man and white alike, was the fabled Three Forks, the many come together country. This game-filled river valley was fed by three merging mountain-bred streams to create the greater river. It lay secluded, this upper Missouri Garden of Eden, some 200 miles from Lisa's stockade, deep within the realm of the feared Piegans, the southernmost clans of the warlike Blackfoot Nation. It was from here that our solitary wanderer dared to leap into Western lore. Yet he was not the first white man to pass this way. Twice before, albeit briefly, the valley, and for that matter, all of the shining mountains, had witnessed the fair skin of white European men and heard the sudden jolting pop of their deadly fire sticks, their long rifles, momentarily splitting the serenity of the air. These white eyes, like wispy clouds casting fleeting shadows upon the land, were just passing through. Yet they had stayed long enough to marvel and record in their individual journeys of wildlife so plentiful, so diverse, and so easy to dispatch. Marked in their collective memories the valley's three rivers and innumerable, cool, clear running creeks, teeming with fat, industrious, luxuriantly coated beaver, so numerous, so prolific, and tantalizingly so, whetting the white man's appetites for the riches from back east their furs would bring. Rested after 2 or 3 idyllic days of hunting, of soaking tired and blistered feet, of mending worn buckskin clothing, fashioning new moccasins and leggings, they packed their dugout canoes with their bags of possibles, their personal belongings, and proceeded on. With bare backs straining away, gripping smooth, hand-polished wooden oars, they paddled westward against the stubborn current of the Jefferson Fork towards the distant sunset and the faraway great salt waters of the Pacific Ocean, leaving the valley behind. Yet this buckskin-clad band of white men could not stay away, not when the valley and the great river were their nexus between the east and the west. So they returned the following summer on their way home towards the rising sun from whence they came. These strange white eyes, with their pale ruddy skin, were never to be seen again in the Piegan people's Okoto Waktai Sakum, their many come together country. Never, never, that is until that lone rider from Manuel's Fort with that same fair skin was to be seen invading the valley of the three rivers once again. He was a strangely clad man, aboard a small crow paint, a piebald Mustang all of 13 hands high, and he rode that tough, compact pony, sitting tall upon a finely tanned apishamore, the red man's saddle blanket of soft buffalo calf skin that made the rigors of long days on horseback more comfortable, endurable, warming him on cold, chilly nights when his saddle blanket became his bedroll. Surely he was not an aboriginal Indian man, not an indigenous native of the high plains country or the mountains of the Northwest. Yet by every outward appearance, he was aptly suited for this wild, untamed land. A well-set-up man, strong of arm, broad of back, and thick of shoulder, with piercing pale blue eyes, wind and snow and cold and sunburnt face and hands, all the while sporting an instinctive countenance that told of one who never stopped looking, listening, sensing all about him. Yet he was undeniably a white man, yet with the look and manner of one entirely at ease in the uncivilized West. Who was this stranger? What kind of man was he to dare trespass in the land of the Siksika, the Blood, and the Pagan? Surely the Great Spirit must know. Was not the divinity Apistotoki, the creator, the knower of all things? So why was he here? What sacred quest allowed our curious, buckskin-clad paladin to travel so boldly alone in a land of perpetual internecine strife, devoid of friend, ally, and favor, risking life and limb, sanity and scalp, far from kin and home? Did he not fear the wrath of the red man? 2 centuries of deceit and distrust and bloodshed between the white man and the red demands explanation here and now, or so surely our stranger's tale will be short-lived and not so sweet. If only he would talk and tell us his story. Let us understand the mystery of his journey unfolding before our eyes. When the idea dawned on me to write a book about John Colter, it was all the way back in 1993. I had no experience writing whatsoever at the time. At first I thought about writing a biography, but there was so little known about the man, and at least one book had been written by a man named Burton Harris way back in 1953 that really adequately covered the known facts of John Colter. But somebody turned me on to the library at the University of California in Berkeley, and I went over there, and I wasn't looking for this, but I found it was an unpublished biography on John Colter written in 1926 by a man named William Gent. And in all my subsequent readings of all the different magazine articles and books and authors that had written about John Colter, none of them ever mentioned Mr. Gent. Well, he was quite active into discovering all he could about John Colter 80 years ago. In fact, finding information on his very beginnings that no other author had ever even heard about. So that launched me on my quest, and as I began writing the book, I struggled somewhat how I was going to tell the story. In fact, I think the hardest time I had writing this book was getting the first sentence of the first chapter. I could do the whole book, but I just couldn't get that start down until my wife gave me the first 2 words, and away I went. This book covers John Colter's life after he left the Corps of Discovery way back in 1806 by the Knife River in North Dakota. It covers almost the next 4 years of his life, which was entirely spent in the Three Forks area or the Yellowstone, Bighorn River area. It touches somewhat on his journey of 1807, 1808, where he was sent out by Manuel Lisa, the man that I mentioned in the beginning there, to bring in the friendly Indian tribes to trade for beaver. Some months after John Colter returned back to St. Louis, he met up with his old boss, William Clark, in St. Louis, and at the time Clark was finishing his journals to have published. And Colter went over his route of 1807, 1808, which looks like it took him over the Bighorn Mountains, down into the area around Cody, Wyoming today, which subsequently became known as Colter's Hell. It was a thermal area that was apparently much more active back in the early 1800s than it is today. His route took him into Jackson Hole, possibly over the southern end of the Grand Tetons, over into the Idaho area, back up and into Yellowstone. There's some dispute whether or not he was actually at Yellowstone Lake, but Mr. Gent, in his unpublished biography, actually puts him there, or a degree off. That's how close Colter's route took him to through Yellowstone Park. But subsequently, this book is about 4 different encounters over the next 2 years that he had with the Blackfeet Indians, in particular the southern clans of the Blackfeet, known as the Piegan. Each one of those trips really became a disaster. Each time he came back knowing the risks that he faced. The actual run, which he's famous for, Colter's Run, of which his cover vividly betrays, was on his second trip out. And each one of those trips could actually be considered another Colter's Run. And subsequently, he departed from the Three Forks area in May of 1810, returned to civilization, and never came back. And you'll have to read the finish of his book to find out what happened to him at the end. Do we have any questions that I could possibly answer? Yes, sir.
So the term Colter's Hill, did that come from Yellowstone or did it come down from south of the Big Mountains?
I think it's the Shoshone River, which was actually first called the Stinking River when he discovered it. And the trappers referred to it as Colter's Hell. I think for a long time people thought Colter's Hell and Yellowstone were one and the same. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Discuss how you obviously first just did a lot of research, and then how did you integrate your own life experience and have the confidence in a way to embellish sort of someone else's life? Because that's kind of scary business, that.
The little known information that we have really wasn't hard for me to understand or envision or conjure up a like-minded scene. In my experiences, especially in South Vietnam back in 1966 and 67, I found the privations and the peril and the fear and all of that comes with war to be just like the experience he faced. In fact, in the first 3 chapters of my book, I tell about him meeting up with the Salish, the Flathead Indians, and participating in a battle that apparently happened between the Madison and the Gallatin in the spring, or late spring, early summer of 1808, in which, if you were to believe the numbers stated, had more participants than the Battle of the Little Bighorn. In my time overseas, I spent a period of time with a Vietnamese Ranger outfit, in which I was just one of 2 Marines attached to this whole battalion of Vietnamese Rangers. And, you know, it's no stretch to think of them as native Vietnamese, just like we refer to Indians today as Native Americans, living with them out in the bush, out in the jungle, sleeping on the ground, many times, without getting too graphic, trapping rats to eat rats, fish, eating tapioca roots. operating in hostile country, people trying to kill you, trying to find them, trying to avoid them in some of the worst weather imaginable. If you could experience a monsoon, you'd probably understand what I'm trying to say. I would think that Katrina is like an average event in Southeast Asia, to be quite honest with you. I hope I answered your question. Yes, ma'am.
Was there a lot of documentation about the Indians that you encountered in this life, or did you
Well, for the most part, I had to go out and find out on my own, and I did a lot of reading. There's a lot of work on the Blackfoot Indian, on the Shoshone. I didn't really find that much on the Salish until after I'd already signed to publish the book. In fact, my wife and I go to the powwow they have every year in Bozeman, and a year or two ago I was able to buy a Salish dictionary, which was really interesting. And I was able to incorporate some of the words I needed into my book from that dictionary. I couldn't pronounce it. I mean, you look at it, and even Greek looks simple compared to the Salish. But, you know, really the advent of the computers made a lot of this stuff quite easy. Did I answer your question, then? Okay.
I just didn't know how much was documented.
Well, you know, just like I explained to that young lady over there, my experience with the Vietnamese and also Montagnards subsequently, you know, once you put a human face on yourself and people begin to accept you or trust you, and you become part of them, so to speak, you find out they're not really all too much different than your next door neighbor or your family, your own countrymen. We're all the same. Human emotions are human emotions. Nobody has a patent on it. Yes, ma'am.
What were those first two words your wife gave you?
Spring labored. Sure. My wife is actually quite gifted. In fact, she did the sketch of my book. Spring labored in the high-up mountains of the Absaroka and in the valley of the Estopaonza, the Elk River. Yep. How'd I do?
How did he do? Putting lots of skin on the bones. It's wonderful. Thank you very much. And you've got the first, yeah, perfect. Perfect. And so we've got the first 17 words, and you've got another, what, 50, 60,000 that you can just pick up at the back of the room. John Fitzpatrick, he never set out to be a writer. For the past 30 years, he's been in business development, public relations, governmental affairs. He even served as the deputy state budget director, I believe, for our fair state. But he is a big fan of mysteries, and in his new novel, Sherlock Holmes, The Montana Chronicles, he's managed to combine what he knows, which is mystery, mining, and Montana, with a love of Sherlock Holmes, his hometown, and even his great-grandfather. Please welcome John Fitzpatrick.
I had planned to use a slideshow today, but the computer crashed, and so last night I made up a few copies here of what would be my presentation. I'll pass them out, and you can follow along if you wish. Well, I'd like to thank Montana Humanities for the opportunity to participate in the book fair this year. I've seen it and got close to attending several years ago, but this is the first time that I've actually been present, and pleased to be here to talk about my book, Sherlock Holmes, The Montana Chronicles. Now, the question that most people ask me about this book is, how is it that you came to write a book about Sherlock Holmes set in Montana? And actually the answer to that question is kind of how did I end up being an author, and how did one turn into being an overnight literary sensation in about 8.5 years. This process that led me to the publication of this book actually began way back in late 1999, when three things kind of came together over a period of about 8 or 9 months. The first thing that happened is I went down with my wife to Billings to attend a football game. My son was playing football for the Helena Bengals, and they were involved in a game with Billings Senior Bronx. And we had to get down there early so we could shop at the mall. Of course, about half of us figured out that that wasn't exactly the best way of spending the afternoon, and I ended up at Barnes & Noble. And as I was cruising around the store, I ended up in a corner where there were a number of books on film and TV, and I happened to spot a book there which was more or less a how-to manual for writing a screenplay. And what caught my eye was the name of the author. It was an unpronounceable Polish last name, but just a few months before, I had bought a book that he had edited, which was something, the title is something like More Stories from the Twilight Zone. I picked up the book, started to look through it, became interested in it, and more or less bought the book on a lark. A few months later, my son graduated from high school, worked in Helena for the summer, and then took off to go to school at Montana State. And the second thing took place, and that is, all of a sudden, it's like I had 3 extra hours a day. Now, I can't quite figure out why that was the case, because he had a car, he had a girlfriend, and he had a bunch of friends, and we were not exactly palling around together, but he was a very active child who always kept his mother, in particular, on pins and needles, and I think I was spending 3 hours a day trying to stay in front of him. The last thing that happened was at that time I was working for Touch America, and my job was taking me all over the United States. And after about 4 times in a row in the Salt Lake airport, sitting there till 2 o'clock in the morning waiting for the red eye, I decided there was something better to do than try to read and get mad at Delta Airlines. And I came upon the idea that I would start to write some fiction. And I decided to challenge myself right out of the chute, so I picked that book up that I'd purchased on script writing and set out to write a screenplay. And I, in fact, wrote a screenplay over the next several weeks. It's titled Searching for Home, and it was intended to be like story number 1 in a 5-part series, a form of an Irish roots. Well, after I finished the screenplay, I gave it to my mother, and you know, mothers are always very objective. She told me a few days later, "John, what a wonderful story." I took it, put it in the filing cabinet, never showed it to my wife because I didn't want to start batting 500 right away. From there, I started to study scripts fairly intensely, and there's a lot of scripts that were available on the internet, and the next area that I kind of moved into was writing radio dramas. And I did that initially because I felt much more comfortable writing dialogue than I did description. And over a course of a couple of years, I crafted a number of radio dramas. Then I moved on to try some short stories, and then finally a novel. And after I'd finished the novel, it was around late 2004, early 2005, and I decided, why don't you try to get yourself published? And that's when I learned a little bit the hard way about what it's like to actually put a book into print, particularly if you're going to do so with a publisher. And I took the book, which was called Country Justice, which is about the murder of an environmental lawyer in a mythical county here in southwestern Montana. And I started off the process of looking for an agent. So I prepared a synopsis and cover letter and sent it out and started to get back rejection slips. Stacked up 20, 25 of those, and then decided, well, let's try a different approach. Let's go to small publishers. And I had looked through these different books like Writer's Guide and the like, and saw that all of the major publishers wanted agented representation, and so I decided to try small publishers, went through the same process, and got another stack of rejection slips. Well, I think it was in 2005 that I happened to be up in Phillipsburg going to a play at the Opera House Theater. And for those of you that haven't done that, you should try to do that sometime in the summer. They always have 3 works on in repertory, and it's a great little night out. And I was sitting there in the audience thinking about what I could do to maybe develop a book or actually develop a stage play. And again, it was just a personal challenge to myself. And I was kind of thinking about what I could do for a stage play, and I was fishing around for an idea, and I walked out into the lobby at intermission, and there above the door, there's a quilt. And the squares of the quilt are made up of, got names on them. Some of the early actors that appeared at the Opera House, and others are some of the plays that they had. And up in the upper left-hand corner, there was a square that said, "Sherlock, is that you?" And that's where this book was born. I went back in with the idea that I would do a Sherlock Holmes story set at the Philipsburg Opera House, and that became what ultimately turned out to be the Opera House Murder. Now again, as I said, I started out to try to write a stage play. I got into it about 5 or 6 pages and realized that I was in big, serious trouble because by that time I had already changed the set at least 5 times, and I knew that that wasn't going to work in real life. So I decided to write the short story first with the intention of coming back and adapting it into a stage play. Well, I wrote the story, which is called The Opera House Murder, which is the first of the 4 stories in my book. And this is about the same time I was going through this quest for publication with my book, or my novel, Country Justice. And when that was failing, I decided to you needed to figure out, if you want to publish something, you needed something with more commercial appeal. So I decided that what I would try to do would be to take the Sherlock Holmes stories and build a compilation of stories of that type. Now, at that point in time, the process changed in a sense because the first story that I wrote, The Opera House Murder, was entirely fictional. All the characters are imaginary. The setting is loosely based on Philipsburg and the Opera House Theater, but the story itself was completely fictional. I made no attempt to weave in any form of Montana history. But as I looked at the process of going forward with a book on Sherlock Holmes, I decided that I would try to look at bringing in some Montana history or some Montana historical characters. And I did successfully put together 3 more stories. I went back through this process of looking for agent representation, then back out with small publishers, compiling more and more rejection slips, and then one day I discovered Riverbend Publishing in my hometown. And Riverbend was a publisher that I had known about. I'd seen their books repeatedly. In fact, bought several of their books. They do a lot of Western Americana, some coffee table books, Yellowstone Park types of things, Montana trivia. And I had seen and purchased their books. They also have been reprinting a number of, major historical books in Montana, War of the Copper Kings, Copper Camp, and the like. And in the process of looking over their book list, I discovered that they had put together a collection of essays, which was edited by a fellow by the name of Rick Newby from Helena as well. And it just kind of hit me that, they're not doing just nonfiction. They're maybe looking at some things that are a little bit different. And so I basically called up, and that turned out to be one of the best decisions that I ever made. It led to a discussion with their publisher, Chris Cobble. I brought him down a synopsis of the book, then later on a chapter, and then finally the whole book, and over a period of several months, and another rewrite, probably rewrite number 8. We ended up putting the book together and bringing it out this spring. Now, the process of developing the book, as I mentioned, it took a turn when I decided that I would try to put the book together. And one of the reasons I kind of focused on Holmes was that one day as I was coursing through barnesandnoble.com and punched up Sherlock Holmes, I discovered that there was just an absolutely immense volume of works for sale on that particular internet site. There's even more on Amazon. And I took part of one day to kind of go through to see how many of those books were written by Conan Doyle or were adaptations of Conan Doyle's books, and how many were actually derivative works written by other authors. Well, at the time I looked at the website, there was close to 1,900 titles listed under the name of Sherlock Holmes, and close to 400 of those titles were derivative works written by others. And I have read a number of those works over time. Began reading with Nicholas Meyer's book, 7.5% Solution, which came out in the early 1970s. And up in here recently, I discovered a series of books in which Sherlock Holmes was set in Minnesota, were written by a fellow by the name of Larry Millett, a retired reporter from the St. Paul Pioneer Press. And it was really Millett who had the idea of bringing Holmes to the United States, and I just simply picked that idea up and ran with the notion that if you could write a good Sherlock Holmes story set in Minnesota, which is flat and boring, you've got to do a really good job if you've got a place like Montana, particularly in the late 1800s. And so that's where I jumped off and started to draft the 3 stories. Now, as I was looking for a way of doing this, I kind of puzzled my way through how should I set these stories up. And I considered, looking at some historical event in Montana and building a story around that. And in the little handout that I've given you, I mentioned Custer's Last Stand. I didn't use or even think about Custer's Last Stand. It was merely an example. But looking for an event that might be suited for Holmes and Watson to be here in Montana. I also looked at the concept of building a story around a historical Montana character, and then finally a setting. And I actually rejected the first two because if you're building a story around a historical event or a known character, you're really constrained to some extent by the biography or the known history of those particular events, and I wanted a little more literary leeway, so I used the setting. Now, these particular stories are set down in the Anaconda-Phillipsburg area, and I use that particular setting because, A, I'm intimately familiar with it, but also because there's a great deal of Montana history which is essentially set in the Butte and Anaconda area in the 1890s when Holmes and Watson would have been busy. And so the three stories that you have that finish off the book, the Tammany Affair, which is built around a threat to Marcus Daly's racehorse Tammany, the Ghost of Red Line, which deals with the theft at a gold camp, Red Line, which is basically up in the mountains up above Georgetown Lake looking on toward Phillipsburg, and then finally the Mysterious Woman, which is also set in the Georgetown Lake area. I took those particular settings, and then as I wrote the story, I incorporated real characters from Montana history into that particular series of stories. And I got those people's names by a very famous historical resource, the Anaconda City Directory from 1896. And actually, those old city directories are really quite fascinating because it starts off with a history of the community, it talks about the economy of the area, and then of course you get into the text and it deals with who lives where on every street in town, and you can see all of the names, and you find the names of the people who ran the businesses, and they became characters in this particular story. Now, trying to write a Holmes story set in Montana really did pose a number of challenges, and one of the first things that I ran into was establishing the correct cultural context. And if you don't think about it, it's really quite amazing how much everyday life permeates the way you think and look at settings, even though you're maybe trying to look back at a period of time 100 years previously. Little things like food, which we all take for granted in our daily life, was very, very different back in the 1890s than it is today. There was effectively no prepared food as people know it today. Everything was done from scratch. There were no cake mix boxes to be found on the stores. Everybody made everything from scratch. Fruits and vegetables, which we take as a daily for granted item in our stores, were essentially non-existent in Montana for most of the year at that time. And just simply describing things like having meals required a lot of thought about what went on at that particular time. The second part that was fairly challenging was to try to establish the appropriate linguistic context. And that's, again, the same kind of a challenge that I faced with the cultural thing. The fact that everyday life or modern life has completely saturated your brain, you'll go ahead and describe situations, and it makes sense to you as you write that thing down, and then you come back and you look at it with a fresh eye, and you discover, you know, you're only 100 years out of step here with the story you're trying to write. And actually, it wasn't until I did about the fifth or sixth rewrite that it dawned on me that I was using Watson to describe Holmes's action in terms of a baseball analogy. And it's something, I don't remember the exact word, but it's something to the effect where Watson was saying, I wonder when Holmes is going to hit the ball. And it finally dawned on me that while we had baseball in the 1890s, I'm not sure that that particular analogy was everyday discourse in the streets of western Montana. The final thing I did was to try to document the story, to try to give it more of a presentation of being truly a history or a book that was edited from Watson's original works. And I did that with an extensive number of footnotes in the book. You don't see too many fictional books with footnotes. This one has about 30. And the footnotes really are really there for two purposes. There are footnotes which are intended to be factual to try to explain the situation set at that time. For example, there's a footnote that deals with the use of steam tunnels. Well, back in the 1890s, particularly in the larger cities, it was quite common for there to be a central heating plant in one building, and they simply ran tunnels and steam pipes around and heated all of the buildings within sometimes a several square block area. This was particularly true in places like Helena and Butte. And there's a reference to that in the thing, and I go ahead and use the footnote to explain the steam tunnel phenomenon and the fact that it really wasn't until the Montana Power Company made natural gas widely available in the 1930s that that particular form of heating in the central business districts changed. I also used some other footnotes to tie the book back to the Conan Doyle legacy, and so you'll find footnotes in there that will describe certain characters or cases that Watson may have chronicled in the past, or characters that popped up in the Conan Doyle stories from the 1890s and early 1900s. And then the last piece was to try to find some photographs to give people some flavor for Montana in the 1890s, and this turned out actually to be a fairly significant challenge. I had set part of the stories at the mining camps west of Anaconda, and I searched diligently for photographs of these little communities and actually struck out. I did find one photograph of the town of Southern Cross at the World Museum in Mining, and it shows up in the book. But I had to try to adapt that thing, and so you'll find a couple of photographs which I took myself in recent years and put them in the book. And there's a couple of examples that I put in here. One is a picture of the Hirsch Free Library where the Watson's Chronicles were discovered in an old safe. And then there's another picture there of the old tramway at the Red Lion Mine, the remnants of which are still there on the hillside. And so, weaving all of these elements together, I've essentially tried to put together a collection of short novels that describe Watson and Holmes' foray here in western Montana. Is it history or fiction? Well, it's fiction. I have taken some historical characters, and I've taken certain historical events and woven them into the story. But I think some historians, if they checked out my facts very, very closely, might find that I played just a little bit fast and loose with the truth, as I was at least careful to point out in the disclaimer at the front end of the book. So thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
You've been blessed with good editors, and/or do you have lots and lots of people read what you write, or is it still in process?
Well, actually, what I try to do when I prepare a manuscript is get it in what I consider to be final shape. I then have a woman that works with me in Helena who is an exceptionally good copy editor, and I have her read the thing. And she's very, very good at picking up the little things like the missing quotation mark and things of that type. I also have the book reviewed by people that will take the time to do it. And finding reviewers to give you a good critique of a book is very, very difficult. Most people, you know, will say, gee, that's a good book, but or I really enjoyed it, but they won't get into it and say, I had questions about this, or I didn't think that was consistent with that. And that's difficult to find, but actually, I found a couple of people in Helena and a friend that I went to graduate school who did a good job for me in that respect. And then by the time I gave it to the publisher, I thought it was in great shape, and he merely handed me back about 110 questions that I needed to answer in the course of making rewrite number 17 or whatever it ended up being. But that process, that was an iterative process. It took several months, and but was very, very productive, I think, in terms of improving the manuscript. You guys are easy.
Sorry. How did you go about researching those day-to-day simple things like food and clothing? Was there one particular source?
No, there wasn't one particular source. I did find really a wealth of information on the internet through Wikipedia. And if I could kind of hone in on a particular subject, that was very, very good. For example, there's a footnote in there that talks about Whitehall, which is, you know, the euphemism for the British government. Well, when I went on to Wikipedia and punched in Whitehall, not only did I get a description of Whitehall, I got a map of the street. And it showed all of the different buildings in there, and the fact that, you know, Holmes's brother at one time supposedly worked at the British Admiralty. Well, I could see the location of the buildings from the 1890s just from going to Wikipedia. Other stuff I found just by looking at Montana history books. You'll find a lot of information, particularly dealing with these kind of cultural things, a lot of times in memoirs, and a lot of these kind of community history books that you find, you know, like the history of Sweetgrass County. Well, you get in there and, it's generally not history as a historian looks at it in the sense of talking about, you know, major events or things of that nature, and it'll talk a lot about families, but a lot of times it will get off and discuss, for example, going on picnics and what people ate. And I found that kind of information to be quite helpful. Did you have a question? In the back room.
Thank you. To extend a little more about finding out what people eat in day-to-day lives, go to conventional history, those kinds of what do people do on a Sunday morning or a Monday morning or evening is very difficult to find. How did you find those kinds of things? What people eat, what they wear?
Well, actually, I found, as I just mentioned here, I found some of it in these kinds of memoir histories, kind of these little community histories that are, kind of prevalent here in Montana. There's a lot of stuff that all around, like the history of Sweetgrass County or early days in Libby and stuff like that. And I've, acquired, or not, shouldn't say acquired, but read a lot of that stuff in the course of my job. And so I kind of had I was able to recall that and go back and look at some of that stuff. But the other place that I found it was looking at newspapers from the period. Now, back in the 1890s, the largest newspaper in Montana was the Anaconda Standard. And I went back in, and as I was looking at these stories, and in fact, I've got a draft of a novel that was built around my sheriff, around my great-grandfather, who was actually the sheriff of Deer Lodge County in this time, and I've used him as a minor character in there. But I went back to look for some of these historical, events and for time frames for these things, and there was little things in there like advertisements from the different stores that would explain what was for sale, and that was also a source of trying to find some of this everyday stuff. Other questions? Well, if not, pardon me, Stephen.
I just, in reference to that last question about cooking food back in the 1890s, my grandparents were born in Butte, grew up in Butte in the 1880s and 1890s, and I live with my grandmother, and I have to tell you, I was a recipient of many a fine Irish potato cake and tripe and
Yeah, I had that same experience, except I didn't put it in the book. I worked in the Central Meat Market in Anaconda when I was in high school, and you described what was for sale in those days, people's eyeballs light up like they can't believe such stuff was even put out for people to consume. But it sold well. Yes, ma'am.
Do you find Sherlock Holmes fans being thrilled that there are more stories, or are they kind of more skeptics?
You get a mixed reaction. It's an interesting reaction. I've had some people comment to me that they thought that I did a masterful job of mimicking Conan Doyle's style, and I have other people say, well, it's a great story, but it's not Conan Doyle. And so you're someplace in between. And the only retort that I really have for that is, Watson's monographs, or his chronicles, were edited by an American, so it's going to have a certain American flavor, and it may not be true Conan Doyle. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today, and hope that you'll have an opportunity to look at my book and Stephen's as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, you could look at the books right now at the back of the room, and I hope you take advantage of the rest of the day. Go wild at the Montana Festival of the Book, and all day tomorrow, too. Thanks for coming.